More disturbingly, each entry ended with a cryptic phrase, "For the curator." The ledger read less like a confession and more like a transaction log. Langston, a mild-mannered man with no criminal record, had worked quietly in library archives for decades. Yet his notes revealed a different life, one of surveillance, coordination, and obsession with historical purity. The artifacts weren't stolen for money. They were taken to be preserved in what he called the private vault, secret location meant to protect history from commercialization. The last entry in the book, dated 2006, simply read, "Final delivery complete. He watches everything." Investigators reopened the case immediately. When they searched Langston's home, they found blueprints for more museums and photos of artifacts yet to be taken. Authorities now believe Langston was only one of many operatives working under a figure known only as the curator, a shadowy collector whose reach may still be active, watching and waiting for the next acquisition. Between 1998 and 2006, 4 wealthy men across 4 different states died under circumstances that were either ruled as accidental or medically natural. At first glance, none of the deaths seemed connected. One slipped and fell in a bathtub, another suffered a sudden cardiac arrest, the third supposedly drowned while boating, and the fourth collapsed during a hiking trip. Each man left behind a grieving widow who had married him within a year of his death. Investigators at the time saw no reason to suspect foul play. The women were cooperative, presented valid identification, and collected large life insurance payouts before quietly relocating. The cases were closed, the deaths forgotten until 2024, when a podcast investigating patterns in inheritance fraud stumbled upon something unusual. A listener sent in marriage records from 2 of the cases, pointing out that the signatures on both were nearly identical. The hosts dug deeper, consulting handwriting experts, and discovered that all 4 marriage certificates appeared to be signed by the same woman using different names. The podcast episode went viral, prompting law enforcement to re-examine the old files. Using modern facial recognition technology, they compared wedding photos, DMV records, and surveillance footage from years apart. The result was staggering. Every image pointed to the same person, despite changes in hairstyle, weight, and even facial structure. The woman behind the aliases was identified as Eliza Wren, a former con artist who had vanished from public records in the early 1990s. Her juvenile file, sealed at the time, included links to a defunct cult known for identity manipulation and psychological control. As authorities pieced together her history, they realized she had reinvented herself over and over, blending into upper-class circles, targeting wealthy men with no close relatives, and expertly vanishing after collecting payouts. Agents tracked her last known movements to a quiet town in Montana, where a tip led them to a local nursing home. A woman matching Eliza's altered appearance had been living there under a different name, charming residents and staff alike. By the time law enforcement arrived, her room was empty. The only thing left behind was a scrapbook filled with wedding photos, each carefully labeled with dates, locations, and phrases like "taken care of" and "perfect fit." Despite renewed efforts, she was never found again. Investigators now believe she may have assumed a new identity and possibly targeted more victims, ones that authorities have yet to uncover or even suspect. The 1990 triple homicide in Ashbridge, Ohio, left the entire town shaken. A prominent psychiatrist, Dr. Gerald Moore, his wife Linda, and their teenage daughter Emily were found murdered in their suburban home. The scene was chaotic: furniture overturned, books torn from shelves, drawers dumped onto the floor. But the most disturbing detail was the red ink messages scrawled across the walls, each one cryptic and unsettling. Phrases like "they knew" and "secrets buried deep" were written in jagged handwriting, covering nearly every room. There were no signs of forced entry, no valuables taken, and no clear motive. For months, investigators worked around the clock, interrogating patients, former employees, and even neighbors. Suspicion briefly fell on a disgruntled ex-patient and a relative with a history of mental illness, but both were cleared due to lack of evidence. Despite local media pressure and community protests demanding justice, the case was eventually declared unsolved and grew cold. In 2023, new homeowners renovating the same house made a chilling discovery beneath the floorboards of the old study. Hidden in a sealed compartment were 8 VHS tapes, labeled simply "Confession." The tapes, dated from 1988 to 1990, appeared to be recordings of private therapy sessions conducted by Dr. Moore. Each featured the same male patient, whose identity was never clearly stated. The man discussed violent thoughts, jealousy, and a deep-seated hatred toward Dr. Moore's family. In the final two recordings, the tone shifted dramatically. The man claimed he was being followed, manipulated, and silenced by their lies. He ended the last tape by saying, "They don't deserve to breathe my air. They'll be erased." Stunned by the find, the homeowners turned the tapes over to authorities. Forensic teams quickly matched the man's voice to a former patient who had been admitted to a private psychiatric facility shortly after the murders. Hospital records showed he had died there years later under a different name. But what caught investigators by surprise was a sealed agreement between the facility and Moore's former medical practice, offering permanent anonymity in exchange for a large donation. It appeared the killer had been hidden in plain sight, protected by a system designed to bury damaging truths. The tapes not only solved the mystery, but also exposed a network of cover-ups in the psychiatric community. Ashbridge's most chilling cold case had always been solvable, its truth carefully hidden beneath the very floors the family once walked. Now, 3 decades later, justice had finally caught up with the shadows. Eleanor Braxton vanished without a trace, Eliza Wren changed faces like masks, Wilbur Langston kept secrets in ink, and 5 kneeling victims whispered through empty graves decades apart. Their stories lay cold, forgotten, until now. Judge Eleanor Braxton was a figure of power and dignity, known for her strict courtroom presence and fierce dedication to justice. In 1994, she left her office late on a Friday night after a long day of closed-door deliberations. On a sensitive corruption case involving several influential businessmen, surveillance footage showed her stepping into the courthouse elevator alone, her signature black briefcase in hand. That was the last time anyone ever saw her. When her car was discovered 3 days later in the middle of the Chattahoochee National Forest, investigators were baffled. The vehicle was locked, the keys missing, and the driver's seat was adjusted unusually far back, suggesting someone taller than the judge had driven it. Her purse was still on the passenger seat, but the briefcase had vanished. A massive search was launched. Helicopters combed the forest, dogs tracked scent trails that abruptly stopped near the riverbank, and volunteers scoured the woods for weeks. No signs of struggle were found, no clothing, no body, nothing. The investigation turned up dead ends. Her colleagues were questioned, her past cases reviewed, and her family put under surveillance. Nothing suggested she was suicidal or planning to run. Eleanor was known for being meticulous, level-headed, and deeply committed to her work. The FBI got involved, theorizing a politically motivated disappearance, but without a body or clear evidence of foul play, the case slowly faded from headlines. It was eventually labeled a cold case, gathering dust in the archives of the Atlanta field office. Nearly 30 years later, in the summer of 2023, the quiet neighborhood where Eleanor had once lived buzzed with activity again. Contractors working on renovations of her long-abandoned property stumbled upon a hidden crawlspace beneath the floorboards of her private study. Inside, among layers of dust and rotted insulation, were 3 haunting items: her judicial robe, soaked in dried blood, a shattered gold watch known to be a family heirloom, and a torn piece of paper bearing a message in shaky handwriting: "He made me." The discovery reignited the case nationwide. Crime scene investigators rushed to the house, and forensic teams began analyzing the newly uncovered evidence. The robe was confirmed to be hers, and the blood matched her DNA. Suddenly, a decades-old mystery became a fresh homicide investigation. Questions that had haunted the city for years returned with urgency. Who was he? Why was the body never found? And why had someone gone to such lengths to keep her disappearance a secret? In the small town of Eldersburg, Illinois, 1987 marked the beginning of one of the most puzzling and eerie crime waves the state had ever seen. Over the course of 6 months, 5 respected community figures were found dead in 5 different cemeteries. Each body was discovered kneeling beside an open, empty grave. There were no visible injuries, no signs of violence, and no forensic evidence to explain how they got there. The first victim was the town's mayor, followed by a school principal, a retired fire chief, a local judge, and a well-known doctor. Each death sent shockwaves through the town, but investigators were left chasing shadows. Autopsy reports showed nothing conclusive: no toxins, no trauma, no trace of foul play. The deaths were officially listed as natural causes, though the strange positioning of the bodies suggested otherwise. Locals began calling it the cemetery code, and theories grew wilder with every new victim. Some believed it was the work of a cult. Others said it was a curse. Psychics, journalists, and out-of-town detectives descended on Eldersburg, but none could make sense of it. The victims had no known connection to each other, no shared affiliations, and no enemies in common. As the years passed with no answers, the town tried to move on. The graves remained open, slowly filled by time and neglect, a haunting reminder of the lives lost. In 2022, an unexpected breakthrough occurred when an intern working for the state's digital archive project flagged a strange pattern in old missing persons reports. The death dates of the 5 Eldersburg victims matched exactly with the birthdays of 5 individuals who had vanished from nearby towns in the 1970s. This coincidence was too specific to ignore. Further investigation uncovered that each missing person had been under psychiatric care shortly before they disappeared. Digging deeper, authorities discovered a common thread: each had been treated at the now defunct Whitlow Behavioral Institute, a mental health facility shut down for ethical violations in 1979. A forensic toxicologist, intrigued by the new link, re-examined the preserved tissue samples from the cemetery victims. Traces of an obscure illegal hallucinogenic compound were detected, one that had been tested during unregulated drug trials at Whitlow. Suddenly, the pieces began to fit. These weren't random deaths. They were carefully orchestrated events, possibly part of a decades-long experiment in psychological manipulation. What once looked like isolated tragedies now seemed like the final act of something far more sinister, and perhaps still unfinished. The string of museum heists that occurred across New England in 2001 baffled federal authorities and security experts alike. Within a 48-hour span, 7 rare artifacts vanished from different institutions: an ancient Egyptian amulet, a 16th-century astrolabe, a Revolutionary War medal, and 4 other priceless historical pieces. None of the museums reported alarms triggered or surveillance footage showing suspicious activity. The thefts were surgical, precise, and left investigators with nothing to work with. Even more puzzling, none of the items appeared on the black market, were never held for ransom, and no group ever claimed responsibility. Thefts on this scale typically left digital or physical traces, but these were clean. The FBI opened a multi-state investigation, but struggled to find a motive or pattern. The stolen pieces varied in origin, culture, and material, offering no obvious connection beyond their historical significance. As months turned into years, interest in the case faded. The only real clue was the eerie timing and coordination, suggesting an inside operation, but background checks on staff and contractors yielded nothing. Suspicions arose about a rogue collector, but without leads, the theory remained speculation. By 2010, the case was quietly shelved. That changed in 2025 when a retired librarian named Wilbur Langston passed away in a small coastal town in Maine. Among his belongings was a locked metal box labeled "For Truth," left in his will to the local historical society. Inside was a worn leather ledger with neat, handwritten entries cataloging each stolen artifact, complete with museum layouts, exact timestamps, and access points. Every detail matched FBI reports.